So last time when we had a conference call, Dennis and Shannon introduced a couple of conceptual frameworks that address issues related to impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation to climate change. And so we've talked a little bit about, what other frameworks are maybe available or appropriate for the work that the center may be doing. And so Shannon asked me to talk about a couple of frameworks that we've developed at NCAR. And so today I'll present two examples of those frameworks. One that we've put together within my group that we worked on extreme heat, and the next one that kind of was a more, was a group effort. So let's go to the next slide, Sharon. So since we were talking about conceptual frameworks, I decided to consult a great resource called Wikipedia. And just kind of looking at the basic definitions, what do we mean by conceptual framework? So the conceptual frameworks basically used in research to outline possible courses of action or to present preferred approach to an idea or thought. And I would argue that in our case, it's not really or, it's also and, because we're trying to put together sort of a map of the, map out different elements of research, but also link that research to action that can influence policy and decision making. Another definition was that because conceptual frameworks are potentially so close to empirical inquiry, they can take different forms depending upon the research questions or problem. And I think that's evident in vulnerability science. So if you go to the next slide. So because when we look at the literature for the last several decades, we see that there have been many conceptual frameworks that have emerged, especially in vulnerability science. And those also include linkages to natural hazards research, more recently climate change, also sustainability science, and ecological resilience, and also resilience of socio-ecological systems. There's a nice review paper by Turner that was just recently published in Global Environmental Change that reviews all those different frameworks and how they fit into the sustainability science. There also have been different opposing views, not really opposing, but different views that we need a diversity of approaches to studying vulnerability, because vulnerability is context-specific. When we deal with different places and people, that it's evident that multiple approaches may be appropriate. On the other hand, there's also this notion that the lack of comprehensive, widely applicable framework to guide both analysis and programmatic efforts for vulnerability reduction have become the bane of vulnerability research. And that also presents challenging for decision makers when they try to assess vulnerability and link vulnerability to adaptation because of the just multiple frameworks and approaches, theoretical approaches that exist out there. Sometimes it's really challenging for decision makers to figure out what approach might be best and how to go about doing those assessments. And so the question that we often ask is, how do we sort of negotiate those, whether it's a context-specific approach or a generalized approach, or can we maybe use both, where we look at similar concepts, but maybe those concepts could be adjusted based on research questions and particular context or ecological setting. So next slide. So here are the two examples that I will present today. So one I mentioned is an extreme heat vulnerability framework that we have developed with a colleague at NCAR, Mary Hayden. So this framework was particularly focused on the study of extreme heat in urban areas, but it also builds on a pretty extensive body of research in natural hazards, climate change, and also sustainability science. So we adapted the framework from, a lot of the research that's been done earlier. However, we adjusted it to fit our research goals, which was to better understand urban vulnerability to extreme heat, link the vulnerability to public health outcomes, and also look at the long-term issues related to urban adaptation. And this framework we've been using for a number of years now, and so it's been a foundation for the project that I will talk about in a few minutes, which we call System for Integrated Modeling of metropolitan extreme heat risk, and acronym of this project is SIMMER. And also they've used it and adapted it to other projects related to floods, droughts, and also vector-borne diseases. And so in the second part, I will also present another framework that we have developed at NCAR also a few years ago, and Shannon definitely took a lead in that. And so this framework takes the heat framework and generalizes it to incorporate much broader theoretical perspective of social and ecological sciences. So it was a group effort. We haven't published it yet, and I would definitely welcome Shannon to contribute to discussion since she had a prominent role in developing it. Next slide. So part one, so we'll talk a little bit about the SIMMER project and the framework that underlies the research. So this is a fairly large collaborative project. As you see, there's many different partners that's involved in the project. It is funded by NASA ROSES, and we are currently in its last year. So the project is, again, looking at the urban vulnerability to extreme heat. We work in Houston primarily, but also we have partners in Toronto. And the idea here was to design a study using the framework that we could do most of our vulnerability work in Houston, but then use Toronto as a way to validate our empirical model, our conceptual framework, so we can really test this idea, how generalizable some of those concepts are. And so we haven't gotten, so we're right now just getting to the Toronto part, and so I think the next year is going to be very interesting to really test some of those assumptions and approaches and to see which concepts can apply in a very broad geographic, ecological, and demographic settings. And some concepts may be specific to particular place and environment. Next slide, please. The research components of this project, so we were interested in characterizing and modeling present and future extreme heat events at regional and local scales. We also were interested in improving representation of urban land cover and radiative thermal characteristics at local and regional scales. Characterizing of site vulnerability and responses, including mitigation and adaptation strategies, was one of the prominent goals of the research. And also because we were interested in public health, we were very interested in determining the combined impact of extreme heat and also characteristics of urban environment and social system on human health. Next slide. So because of those kind of research components and also just, looking at the past research, we realized that the relationship between human health and extreme heat is a complex medical, social, and environmental issue. And so even though there have been a number of studies published on this topic, we still feel like that information about all elements of urban systems vulnerability is needed for public health interventions and climate adaptation. And so that really led us to develop this very interdisciplinary project. So next slide, please. And so which uses a framework that is currently shown on the slide. So, and I will walk you through that, some of those concepts, and also show examples of types of data that we're mapping onto this framework. So we started with this framework as our conceptual idea, how would we want to study this issue. Later on through this project, we actually used the framework to design the measurements, the modeling experiments, the data collection, field data collection, and integrating those different diverse data sets into spatial statistical models. So here we define vulnerability as a function of three interactive components. So we're looking at the exposure, which is in this situation is a climatic or synoptic weather conditions, which also could be exacerbated by reflective, storage, transportation characteristics of urban materials and vegetation. And we're really concerned here about the intra-urban distribution of heat, which is shown kind of in the center of the exposure box. And here we're using mostly quantitative environmental models or measured data. Sensitivity Here shows, we define it as an extent to which a system or population, in this case, can absorb impacts without suffering long-term harm. And so we're looking here at such factors such as age and health conditions, socioeconomic and sociocultural factors, neighborhoods, characteristics. And these are the types of data that's typically represented by quantitative demographic information that's collected by census, information that aggregated to different census measurement different census units. And this type of information also publicly available often to conduct vulnerability assessments. Adaptive capacity we define as the potential of a system or population, again in this case, to modify its features and behavior so as to better cope with existing or anticipated stressors. And adaptive capacity is probably the most understudied element of vulnerability. Here we're looking at the local level adaptive capacity, where we're interested in better understanding household level knowledge, attitudes, practices, access to household resources, social capital, which also includes social network, and also availability of community resources and risk reduction programs. And these are types of data that could be quantitative and also could be qualitative. And because largely some of that information is not readily available through public databases such as census or other databases, we collect that information through surveys and also through interviews and focus groups. And so we really, when we put those together, we argue that each of these components, exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, has a set of dynamic and spatially variable indicators. And these indicators could be in turn affected by external drivers, which is a green box on the left. And those could be either climate change, urbanization, urban development, population change. So those are macro level environmental and social perturbation and stressors that also have been discussed in some other frameworks related to resilience and vulnerability. And the example here would be a pathway of urban development. For example, a large-scale urban agglomeration can influence urban land use, and urban heat islands then can affect human exposure to excessive heat during the day and night. Or on the other hand, some of the macroeconomic stressors, such as economic downturn, can affect sensitivity of the population through their impact on housing, employment, and also health conditions of individuals, for example, limited access to health care. So we're interested in studying all of those different elements of the vulnerability because we're trying to understand how they related to the impacts. In this case, those are negative health impacts, heat-related mortality and morbidity. And by developing those associations between different elements of vulnerability and the negative outcomes, we concerned with finding appropriate adaptation and response actions. In one situation, perhaps it could be urban design and land use change. You know, if we see that, for example, characteristics of urban environment has the highest, perhaps, correlations with the heat-related morbidity and mortality. In other cases, it could be targeted warnings if we see population that may not be speaking English language or have a cognitive understanding of warnings. Community-based programs may be appropriate in some situations, public health education, outreach, public assistance. So the idea really here is to identify which elements of vulnerability contribute to negative health outcomes in any particular census, let's say census tract or census block group, and design intervention and adaptation strategies that would be appropriate for that particular, to deal with that particular vulnerability. Next slide. So just very briefly, I've always just to give you some idea of what types of data then we're mapping onto those concepts. So by looking at exposure, we can look at the local level and regional level. So here we're using local scale models such as WRF, EarlDAS, satellite remote sensing MODIS data, also urban land cover data sets such as NUDAPT, which is the pretty large urban data set. We go to even a parcel level to understand what types of buildings we have, what types of building properties might contribute to exposure. and also regional scale climate models, so we can look at the broader patterns of extreme heat and how, for example, indices like humidex that's shown on this map on the right is distributed spatially, and also temporally. I don't have a temporal illustration here. Next slide. So when we look at the external drivers, we hear concerns of how, for example, climate change and urbanization may affect future heat events. And so again, here is just an example to showing how we use regional climate models, which is a community or system model and urban community land model, and look at the simulations of future heat stress days and heat stress nights. And here's just a graph that's showing the increase in heat stress nights and heat stress days for both Houston and Toronto. So we can better understand what types of potential changes in the exposure that the decision makers will have to deal with. Next slide. So sensitivity, I think that has been used very widely in vulnerability assessment, so kind of a typical census level analysis where we look at demographic and socioeconomic and sometimes housing characteristics. So here's just an example again of different types of demographic variables that we would consider in the analysis. And at the local level, we'll be using we're looking at the census block group level to see the distribution of some of those sensitive populations. And so we see in the map, for example, the distribution of non-white minorities on the top map, and the map below shows fractional buildings without air conditioning in Houston. So this, again, just examples of showing some of the sensitivities. Next slide. So adaptive capacity, I have mentioned that we try to collect this information using social surveys. And the map on the top shows the households where we conducted the survey in 2011 in Houston. So we had 901 residents that responded to the survey. And here we're really trying to put together questionnaires where we can learn more about knowledge, attitude, practices, social capital, household resources, different programs. And here's just an example, again, of the social capital questions where we ask people about their relationships with their neighbors, whether they know their neighbors, talk to their neighbors, willing to ask their neighbors for help, whether they check on their neighbors, and so on, so we can assess, in case of emergency, what types of potential social networks may be available to different residents in Houston. And in addition to that, we also conducted the Stakeholder Survey. And let's go to the next slide. And I will talk about the Stakeholder Survey in just a minute. So I think this is a little bit out of the order, but that's okay. But before we go to the Stakeholder Survey, I wanted to show another example how we now take different data from the climate, from measuring and modeling of the exposure, sensitivity. This particular analysis does not include adaptive capacity because that would be a next step, but basically that information goes into some of those spatial and statistical models. And here we're using multi-level statistical modeling to understand the relative risk and better understand what types of population and where in the city of Houston we may see the relative risks and what types of associations we see with heat-related mortality and different elements of sensitivity. And so it's interesting that even in a very air-conditioned city of Houston, that we still see very similar vulnerabilities that we see in other cities, that we see strong associations with elderly, people who live alone, low-income population, African-American population, also residents without central air conditioning, also people who use public transportation. So in a sense, we're trying to understand, again, kind of this idea, what can be context-specific and what can be generalizable when you look at different ecological and geographic settings. And so it's interesting that we see very similar patterns of vulnerabilities that, for example, we can see in cities like Chicago and Philadelphia that may not be that air-conditioned as Houston. So let's go to the next slide. So I mentioned the Stakeholder Survey, and I think so that also presents an interesting example of how we can link some of the vulnerability assessments to, for example, better designing coping and adaptation strategies. So here we did a stakeholder survey and asked them how they, for example, what do they think about heat health risks, and what types of potential vulnerability that maybe they may experience in the future. And so this graph shows what how they ranked, at least what they have identified as potential that may increase vulnerability in the future. And as we see here, a lot of people identify that it's a growth in population with underlying medical conditions, or increase in senior population. Again, this is a sensitivities in a framework that can contribute to future vulnerabilities. So they also identify the potential for additional extreme weather-related impacts that can overwhelm the system. So that kind of speaks to perhaps the infrastructure type development and urban planning that also may need to be taken into consideration. Let's go to the next slide. So another interesting part, so we asked the stakeholders to describe how you think the vulnerability to health risks from extreme heat may decrease in the future. What types of strategies may be most effective? And so interestingly, that 60% of our respondents said that it's a non-structural ways for reducing urban vulnerability to extreme heat that may be feasible and effective, and that links that this types of responses can be linked to adaptive capacity. And for example, they identified such factors such as improvements in preparedness and response capacity, community-based adaptation, such as community centers, cooling centers, and also there have been some suggestions in improving urban infrastructure as well that could be related to urban planning. Next slide. So that kind of sums up, some of the nuggets of the research. I just showed a couple of small examples, but again, what we're working on right now is that we have the risk maps. They have a pretty good understanding of exposure sensitivity, and also how the climate change may potentially impact extreme heat events. So now we're working on using the household survey and adaptive capacity to better explain and contextualize the high relative risk of extreme heat, so those intervention strategies could be developed in the context of those neighborhoods. We're also looking at future scenarios of heat health vulnerability and feasible adaptation strategies, kind of on a more broader scale for those cities, and developing decision support tools that can link those neighborhood level vulnerability information with public health interventions and urban heat island mitigation. So let's go to the next slide. So here's where I'm going to switch the gears a little bit and talk about the conceptual framework that we've developed at NCAR about 3 years ago. And I included this graphic before because this was a little bit, has been more kind of a recent illustration of the type of science that we have in the Climate Science and Application Program in RAL. It also includes social science, different social science groups in other parts of NCAR. So it really synthesizes that, we're concerned with integrated science and service to society, and there's a lot of integration of physical dimension, social dimensions. Let's go to the next slide. And so kind of having that in mind, that it's a fairly diverse group of scientists that worked on this framework a few years ago, so we took this heat framework that I just described, and we tried to generalize it in order to better represent different types of research, and also different theoretical approaches and concepts that the researchers in our group have been working on to make it more general. So here we don't have a well-defined impacts and outcomes compared to the extreme heat framework, where we had a very specific health outcomes, and we were trying to better understand and predict those outcomes and reduce those outcomes. So, but here we say that, we could have a number of outcomes. Some of them could be positive, some could be negative, but those are a little bit more loosely defined section of the framework. But here we view vulnerability as susceptibility of socio-ecological system to harm from the effects of climate variability, change, or extremes. So now we're not looking only at the extreme events as we did before. Now we're looking at the whole spectrum of different climatic stressors and also climate variability and change. So let's go to the next slide. So we look at, again, kind of an interplay between exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, and I will kind of briefly define each of them. So exposure here we define as climate or biophysical conditions along with the nature and degree to which the built or managed environmental conditions position society to experience stressful effects from climatic stimuli. And so the elements of exposure include such things as biophysical conditions, seasonality shifts, physical and biophysical landscape changes, and also local and regional landscape use. So again, you know, we're kind of moving away from urban systems, we're looking at a broader spectrums of physical conditions, landscapes, and also potential changes in the exposure through seasonality and land use. Next slide. So sensitivity here is defined as a non-climatic factor to determine the degree to which a socio-ecological system is negatively or beneficially affected by climate stimuli. And it's important to mention here that we really target the non-climatic factors, which may be different from some of the other frameworks. And here we're looking at demographic factors, cultural factors that also include norms and values. We're looking at the human and ecosystem health, and also cumulative stressors, whether there have been previous stressors that can exacerbate the some of the climatic stressors that can be experienced through exposure. The next slide. So adaptive capacity is defined as the potential of a system or population to modify its features and behavior so as to better cope with existing and anticipated climatic stressors. Here we have capital, and the capital here is defined more broadly. It could be human, social, material, natural capital, or financial capital. We're also looking at existing knowledge, attitude, and practices, and also flexible and supportive institutions and governance. So this is, again, kind of more social behavioral science, but also includes elements of the natural capital as well and institutional networks. Next slide. So the drivers, the green box on the left, so now we have also expanded set of drivers. So the factors that shape the conditions of the system, such as climate change, macro-scale socioeconomic conditions, environmental stressors, and also policy trajectories, because we also concerned with things like governance and institutional change. It's also an important driver that can influence systems vulnerability. But we're also looking at things like landscape use and change, natural resource use, consumption and management, macroeconomic changes, global climate variability and change, and some other socioeconomic and environmental changes as well. Next slide. So here on the right side, we broke the coping and adaptation into two separate categories. So coping response is a socio-ecological system's immediate or short-term reaction to ameliorate or mitigate the effects of a climatic hazard. So here we're looking at disaster relief, for example, rebuilding and recovery, public assistance that might be necessary in some situations related to climate extremes and hazards, and also private sector and household responses. So those are short-term actions that taken usually either during or right after an event. On the other hand, adaptation, let's go to the next slide. So it's a process or an outcome of a decision-making that results in fundamental long-term systematic change of a built environment, managed landscape, or ecosystem or social system in response to or anticipation of climate variability and change. So here we're looking at things like improved infrastructure, community empowerment, education, outreach, new economic programs, subsidies, taxes, research and development, and also new institutions and forms of governance, as well as land use policies. So as you see, there is also different feedback loops on this diagram. Some of those long-term adaptation changes affect the types of drivers that can in turn impact vulnerability, and also there are connections between coping responses and vulnerability as well. So there is some feedback loops, and also in some of our discussions and constructing of this framework, we had multiple kind of visual representations, and some of them also included temporal dimensions. That it's not a one kind of a snapshot in time; it's a process, and some of those temporal elements also represented here, such as previous stressors or some of the processes that may take place and may take time in developing. So it's a dynamic process, and it includes spatial and temporal elements that interact in a fairly complex way. Next slide. All right, so I think that was all I had. Maybe you go back, Shannon, so we can have the framework. So just to mention, so this was, if the first one was conceptual framework, but it also was a foundation for, it was also served as an analytical framework in a number of research projects. In this particular situation, we tried to combine as many concepts as we could, except probably with more emphasis on human and social systems rather than ecological systems. And I know that, last time we talked about that, ecological systems are equally important, and so definitely one limitation of this framework that it doesn't look at some of the ecological vulnerability and resilience as explicitly as it looks at social systems. So, but that's something definitely we can, discuss and improve this framework. And Shannon, I don't know if you want to add anything since you've been part of this process and led this process.
Yeah, thanks, Olga. That was fantastic. I would just reiterate and sort of highlight some of the things Olga just said at the end of her discussion, which was the group of us that were at NCAR that were developing this framework. Our strengths are primarily in the social science side of things and on the climate side of things. So those of you who are coming at this from the more kind of ecosystems, ecologist perspective or land and resource management perspective probably can tell that from how this framework developed, that what's missing in this framework, and part of the reason that we're having these discussions and have this working group, is to try and really flesh out those ecosystem aspects of this to include in this framework or use this as a foundation and tweak it in a way that is better suited for the type of land and resource management context that the North Central Climate Science Center is going to be dealing with. And so you can see when you look at this framework that there are aspects of this that overlap with some of the ecosystems framing in terms of natural capital, in terms of land use, land change, the biophysical conditions. But if you read the Scanning the Horizons document, which is one of those foundational documents for the whole Department of Interior Climate Science Center initiative, you'll note that the way that exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity are framed in that document, it's specifically looking at mainly species, habitat, and ecosystems. So the development of that document actually, from what I understand, I wasn't involved in developing that document, but I know Dennis was and some other folks maybe even on the call. They actually developed that document in a similar way that Olga and Mary did when they developed the HEAT document, was taking some of those foundational vulnerability and adaptation scholarships and building that out in a natural resource management ecosystems context. So we, with this, kind of went in a different direction because we were focusing more on the human dimensions. So really, the conversation we want to have here forward is how do we kind of merge those back together in a way that we can kind of build that community of practice within the context of the North Central Climate Science Center to move forward in terms of developing the scholarship in integrated social ecological systems framing to then inform adaptation planning for the region. So that's really all I have to say, and I think now, unless Dennis has anything to say, we can open it up for questions.
Let me just add that I think overall the framework presented here is consistent with the way that Shannon and I have been thinking about the emergence of a socio-ecological response strategy through looking at the system through a vulnerability lens, looking at some of the difficulties and complexities of unpacking adaptive capacity. The comment of, how do we actually enrich this current set of figures with the ecological, environmental, natural resource side is something that I think we can do, and in the next month or two, probably start making some steps in that regard. But I'm really pleased at seeing sort of the comprehensiveness of these type of frameworks, and I see them as consistent with the way that we have been discussing moving forward. So with that, I'll just open it up to others.
So questions, comments?
If you're on mute, unmute.
Yes, unmute yourself and speak.
Well, this is Tom Olaf, and I'll just say it's really interesting to see these more human focused vulnerability assessment frameworks. I've been working more on the resource frameworks, and obviously I think part of the vision of this group is to kind of mesh the two. So for me, this is a good education, and seeing how in-depth that some of the ones for the human dimensions, or at least the human-focused ones, have been. So I really appreciate the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Tom.
I have a question. Kathy Galvin.
Why don't you get a little bit closer to the phone?
So where would you fit in something like incentives for people or groups of people to have different kinds of coping or adaptation responses, whether they're financial or incentives in terms of policy or anything?
To me, that's sort of like the interface between adaptive capacity and response strategies. We had a discussion yesterday with a group of looking at the role of agency and groups who can enable sort of the development of incentives to really promote that. But I think in looking at, and I'm sort of during Olga's talk, I was mapping out some of the features that she was describing and trying to actually walk through a set of how do you take response strategies and implement them back through adaptive capacity, and looking at those sort of resource capitals or those capital assets and trying to engage them in a way that you can actually implement a particular strategy or look at the options of those.
Yeah.
It's like at that little arrow right there.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of what asset, and by the way, we do not in the social sciences say adaptative capacity. That's misspelling by our graphic designer, and he sent us this slide without the ability to revise it. So, yeah,
I didn't even notice that.
Yeah, it's been bugging me for the last year now because I haven't been able to get that fixed because we don't have the original slide, but we can work on that later. But anyway, yeah, it's that sort of issue of what sort of capital is existing, and then in an event, say, what can be utilized for coping, and then in a more adaptation sense, what kind of programs and policies need to be targeted to adapt to provide better capacity for future stresses.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking sort of this idea of institutions and governance could play a big role in how the incentive system is developed, which in turn links to the capital and the responses.
Anybody else?
So this is
some space. Go ahead.
Here in Montana. Hi, everybody. I was late. Sorry. So I had two. These are just totally off the top of my head thoughts here. But in terms of linking ecological responses to, with human responses, or maybe ecological adaptation to human adaptation, this is where it seems like there's this asynchronous sort of time frame here, because, or maybe I'm struggling with the coping response short-term and adaptation long-term, because we as humans have a really hard time having decisions stand really for a long term. We're really reactive, I guess is what I'm saying. And I'm just wondering if you see sort of these ecological responses or adaptation, how do you see putting them together? How can they be put together in this temporal time frame? Because you're going to have, I see it as not coping and adaptation, but it's just along a continuum, right? And then it would be the same for ecological changes, and it would be kind of interesting because there's going to be a lag effect, right? So we have land use change policies, well, that's going to affect our ecological systems. So there's an interactive effect, and there's sort of a time lag effect. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Certainly, yeah. And just to again reiterate one of the things Olga said, this issue of time and spatial scales and how dynamics of any given system change across space and time is really hard to represent in this in this dimensional framework. And so we actually, Olga mentioned how we had some other versions of this which would make all of your head spin, because it's much more complicated even than this, and tried to get at some of those time scale dimensions as well, time and spatial scale dimensions, as well as cross scale linkages, and we just didn't have the right graphic designer to really help us see that through, and so we weren't able to get to that point, and I don't know if we ever can, because again, it's really, you kind of need a three-dimensional dynamic sort of visualization for that, and maybe somebody else has ideas, but you're absolutely right. I mean, the time lag in terms of, policy implementation and seeing effects of that is certainly huge, and I would just say, to your point about humans being mostly reactive, I hear that a lot, and I do think that there's a lot of truth to that, but there's also a lot of evidence in the literature and throughout history of humans also being able to think long-term and being able to plan for long-term. And in fact, the National Climate Assessment Adaptation chapter that I was an author on, we got to get a real sense of that across the country. And in fact, there's a lot going on right now, at least on the planning side of things, in terms of adaptation. And it's early in the evolution of that as a society. And so I would say there's definitely a lot of truth to this, we're inherently sort of reactive species, but by the same token, I do feel that there's a lot of evidence out there that we are, as a society, collectively moving into an adaptation mode, and even globally, because I've done some research looking internationally at what's going on right now in terms of adaptation strategies. So I encourage people to look at the draft chapter of the National Climate Assessment Adaptation chapter, although with that said, again, there's a bit of a disconnect between what's happening in a more sort of urban adaptation context and even water resource management context, which oftentimes has a big urban component to it, and the natural resource management, land management context. And we actually had a pretty hard time as we were looking for case studies trying to identify within the natural resource management world some really good on-the-ground adaptation, planning, and implementation that was happening. So we are not alone in the North Central Climate Science Center in trying to, really facilitate and build out this area of assessment and planning and implementation, and to take that even further, evaluation, which is somewhere we hope to go but is even trickier. But I think that we're on the right track in terms of moving in that direction. But you're right, Liz, there are some really fundamentally different issues that you have to address in the context of natural resource management and land management on a federal scale, especially when you're looking at, protected area, conservation areas, parks, and refuges and things like that. So again, that's exactly why we hope to have those folks involved in this call, and Tom Olaf is with the Park Service, so I was glad to hear him chime in. But any of the other people who might be on who are either agency representatives or working closely with agencies, I encourage you to chime in and really help us flesh this thing out. I think is Kat Hawkins still on the phone?
Yes.
Did you have any thoughts or comments in that regard, Kat? Because I know you've been thinking about this for a while.
No, I think we're all continuing to think about it.
Exactly.
Good.
I guess this is Heather. One thing I would add is just that, especially with the more generalized framework that Olga presented, it's really malleable. So it can be malleable to different timescales, I would imagine. And to the point of humans sort of being very, very reactive, I think that that's true when we're thinking specifically about, responding to climate change. But I would argue that a lot of what turns out to be adaptation and adaptive, systemic change may happen, incrementally for reasons that are not as explicit as responding to climate change, but end up having that sort of epiphenomenal effect and can be very effective. But Kathy might actually be able to say more to that than I. But it comes to that sort of directed or undirected adaptation. If you come to the same goal in the end, I think we need to find a way to sort of recognize that in these kinds of frameworks as well.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. Good points. We have about 5 minutes left, so Dennis and I just had a couple of sort of housekeeping issues in terms of upcoming events to mention really quickly. But does anybody else have anything they want to make sure gets on the record right now before we start to wrap things up?
Yeah, I had a comment. This is Nick Fisicelli with the Park Service in Fort Collins, and I just started in this job about a month ago, and Kat's actually sort of put a bug in my ear about this, and so thinking about this framework that you have, and really I'm thinking about how it sort of fits into the larger decision-making framework, and thinking about parks and ecology, and really determining what your goals are, and identifying the issues that you have. And we see vulnerability assessments as one aspect in that sort of decision framework, and then I think for us the challenge is determining then sort of in a triage where do you actually then put your management capital and your actions. And so for us it's trying to, I think an issue is just determining where we go after the vulnerability assessments and how we weight, say, the different issues. But I think the framework that you guys have here is really useful, and I think it could easily be used within an ecosystem context.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, and we can certainly, via the context of the webinars or one of our upcoming meetings, either at the National Adaptation Forum or the workshop here on the 5th, start to look at some of those broader decision frameworks and a broader adaptation process, of which, like you said, Nick, vulnerability and adaptive capacity assessment is just a part, and ideally, you know, you have the resources and you have the time to be able to do that on the front end, and you have the time and resources to be able to do it comprehensively, but in reality, that doesn't always happen. So in which case, you know, sometimes people choose then to do rapid vulnerability assessments or some other type of information gathering and assessment that helps to inform their decision-making process. So I definitely appreciate that comment, and we can certainly, you know, start to move into more of that type of a discussion, because that's definitely also our thinking that, you know, we're not just talking about vulnerability assessment per se, but we are talking about this broader kind of decision context in which land and resource managers have to operate. And as a center, you know, how can we support those decisions? And it's not necessarily strictly through a vulnerability assessment, but by creating other decision support assessments and tools and so on. So I appreciate that comment. Anybody else? All right, so I think that probably wraps up the webinar. And Olga, thanks again so much for the presentation. Our next webinar that we're planning is going to be with the USGS PASA folks, the social science outfit over at the Fort here in Fort Collins. They're going to present their Assessing Socioeconomic Planning Needs tool that they're in the early sort of launching phase of. And so I think we're going to do that. We're going to try to plan to do that sometime mid to end of March. I think instead of having everybody fill out another doodle, I'm just going to kind of usefully use the popular times that were indicated in the last doodle. So it's looking like probably Thursday. I think around 11 or 1 p.m. was good for a lot of people. So we'll probably just go ahead and plan it, and hopefully that works for a good majority of the people. And then just to let you guys know the status of the National Adaptation Forum, which is, again, early April, the 2nd through the 4th, and then our workshop on the 5th. I am still, unfortunately, waiting to get confirmation back from the planners, the organizers of the National Adaptation Forum, in terms of exactly when and for how long and what kind of room and what kind of resources and all that we're going to have for our working group session at that adaptation forum. There's actually kind of a small number of people that are able to attend that, and they did tell us that we are going to be having a lunch session. So probably it's going to be a little bit less formal than what we're going to do on the 5th, which is going to be a day-long workshop. But just so you guys know that I'm still waiting to get confirmation on that, which is why I haven't sent anything out to the group. And then once we get that, we can start planning that, and Dennis and I are in discussions already kind of planning what we want to do on the 5th. So that's the update that I have. Dennis, did you have anything else?
So stay tuned for the April 5th workshop. I think what we'll try to do is either next week or the week after, the first week of March, is actually send out to you some guidelines for information that would be useful to structure the workshop. And what is emerging is sort of, you know, what are some of the type of issues, management questions that you're dealing with from your personal project side, and then sort of larger within your agency or within the group that you're working with, what are some of the issues that you're dealing with, so we can have a sort of a flavor of what sort of resource targets, management targets that you might be dealing with, and then be able to review this framework and others in context of how we might go about addressing some of these management resource challenges that we're dealing with in the context of climate change. So we'll try to put together some guidance around that, and then also, you know, sort of solicit from you also information on type of approaches that you're dealing with, because I think in our thinking we've been really trying to come up with sort of what are the various planning mechanisms people are using, how can we come up with the more comprehensive one that isn't a menu-driven one, or one that's really you have to do all this, but one that provides some guidance on the type of ecological and social dimensions that you may want to consider in coming up with these planning documents. So anyway, we'll generate that within the next couple of weeks.
All right, I think that wraps it up. Thanks again, everybody, and you'll be hearing from us soon.
Yep, and we'll post where you can find this information and this service, some summary comments from this presentation.
Oh, yeah, and just a note about that. Unfortunately, for some reason, the WebEx USGS tool does not work well on Macs. So unfortunately, if people have a Mac, they might have a problem viewing this later, just FYI. So,
okay.
All right, that should do it. Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Great,
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.